It's time to talk about the movie shooting menu. So as we dive into this, let me just say that I think we're going to have three different types of settings in here. Number one are things that we've already talked about in the movie section, but we'll kind of review them and talk about them again, but not in as much detail. We're going to talk about a lot of things we've already seen in the previous photo shooting menu, and they're just so that you can have two different setups, one for stills, one for videos. So we're going to go pretty light and fast through that. And then there's going to be some new stuff we haven't talked about, and that's what we're going to concentrate on. So let's go ahead and dive in. All right, now you got to remember when you want to get the camera in the movie mode, you got to go movie button and then the info button to switch back and forth between the stills and the movie mode. All right, so first page, first tab in this first item is the movie record quality, maybe the most important item. We talked about this before, but in here we have a little bit of a sub-menu. First up, we have our recording size. This is going to be our resolution, our frames per second, and our compression. And so in here, won't go through this completely, but just a quick little review. We have our different size options, Full HD, which has been for many years kind of a good standard, Ultra HD, 4K, and now this camera shoots 8K. I don't consider this camera a full-on 8K camera. It's a kind of limited 8K camera because there are many limitations as to how long you can shoot with it. It's a very good 8K camera, but it's just limited in how long it can shoot because of the form factor and the heating up that happens with the camera. We have a lot of different frame rates. You can choose what's appropriate for your project that you're working on. And then we have different compression settings that will allow you to shoot different file sizes. The all-eye interframe type ones will be a little bit better for editing. If you want to get down to the frame, if you want to capture still frames from it, it might be a little bit better in that regard. The compressed settings, the IPB, are going to give you much smaller file sizes. I talked about this all in the movie shooting section earlier in the class, and the file size is one of the big differences between these different modes. And so be fully aware of what modes you're in, because it's going to have a huge impact on downloading and working and editing with these files in here. And so let's go ahead and jump in here just in case you might have missed it before. We got to first get our camera into a movie mode. So we're going to press the mode button, hit the info button. Now we're in the movie mode. So when we hit menu, this first tab over here on the left is very different through all these different settings in here. So in the movie recording quality, we jump in here, movie recording size. We have three different options going up and down. The top is going to be your resolution and aspect ratio. And you'll notice that when you select certain settings, like over here at 8KD, we have an option of RAW down on the bottom, but we don't get that option with, I think, any other option there. So just realize that not everything works with everything. You are somewhat limited by certain options that you are selecting. I'm going to go ahead and leave it in 4K, 30 frames a second, and IPB is pretty good for a lot of general video, although 4K is actually pretty high, but in this camera, it's kind of average. So that is your quick 2 bits on resolution. All right, so for the high frame rate, a lot of fun. If you want to slow motion down, you can record information at 120 frames a second, slow it down into a video that is at 30 frames or 25 frames if you're in PAL for this. Now, unfortunately, if you are wanting to put it in 24 frames a second, you're going to have to work with the video footage outside the camera in order to kind of transfer that over. It just kind of bakes it into a 30 frame per second video. But when you do this, there is no sound, as a little reminder on that issue. The 4K high quality mode results in files that are about the same size as regular 4K mode. The difference is that it is oversampling on all the pixels within that area, and it's reading all of that information. How it gets its standard 4K, I'm not totally sure if it's doing a line skipping or pixel binning or some other system in order to kind of get that 4K file a little bit easier. But this oversample mode will get you just a little bit more detail and resolution, even though the file size is not that much bigger. However, it is going to be a lot more processing on the camera. There are limitations as to what you can do with it. The camera might heat up a little bit more quickly, And so if you're not really sure which one of these to use, I would recommend doing a test to see how big a difference it is to you and how big shooting that makes a difference in your workflow. All right, next up is movie cropping. So one of the options you have is to shoot with a cropped in frame. And this is going to be a 5.1K oversampled area that you can shoot 4K. It's going to be real handy if you need more telephoto lens than you might have. If you just want to record a smaller size frame, it's just a good option for recording that smaller size frame, but still getting 4K video. Sound recording is going to head us into a submenu. So in here, most of this is going to deal with the built-in microphones on the camera. And remember that it's just a mono microphone of limited capability, shall we say. So we do have an auto setting if you want to record just really simple basic sound. If you do want to have a little bit more control, you probably want to set this up manually, listen to your audio on headphones, and then make adjustments from there so that it's recording the right levels. You can go in here once you have set manual for the sound recording, then you can come in and you can set your levels according to the sound environment that you are in. The wind filter attenuator will go into another submenu where you can turn on either of these features. The wind filter, there is a really bad sound when you have wind hitting the front of the camera and it's recording sound there. It's basically the sound of wind hitting your camera, and you can turn on a filter that will automatically, well, it lessens, it dampens that sound, makes it a little bit better, but if you really do need to get good quality sound, whether it's in wind or otherwise, you really ought to get a separate external microphone. Now the attenuator will kind of dampen loud sounds as well, not just wind, but any type of loud sounds. It could be a voice, it could be fireworks, and it just tries to compress the sound into the range that it can record. It can get a little awkward if sounds go up and down because it's changing its recording level doing that, so you may want to do a test out to see how well that works for what you're doing. All right, so that was our sound recording. Next up, moving on to page 2, exposure compensation. We should know what this does at this point now, and this is just here so that you can have a separate exposure compensation in video versus what you have set up in stills. ISO speed settings is another topic that we've talked quite a bit about, but here is where you get to have separate settings for the video world as opposed to your stills. So here is where you would set your basic ISO setting to start with. Next up, we have our speed range, and this is where you get to select the minimum and the maximum. And so here, probably want to choose 100 to 51,200, which is the max range for shooting movies. You want to generally have the most available as far as an option, as far as this is your camera, you're the one that gets to choose. You don't want to have to dive back in the menu to unrestrict yourself from shooting something. So set the widest range possible here. It makes sense in most situations. If you do want to use auto ISO, this is where you can kind of set a limit as to what is the highest ISO you want to use when shooting movies. And this can be different than the one you set for stills. If you are shooting time-lapse video, you can have auto ISO set to help kind of accommodate light changes in that. And here you can set a different maximum ISO rating when you are using auto ISO just for that time-lapse photography. Okay, next up is the HDR PQ settings. And so if you are wanting to shoot movies with this setting on, they're designed to be sent out to HDR TVs and monitors type devices that can handle that type of signal. You'll get a little bit better dynamic range. The picture might look a little bit better. So this is one of those things that you might want to test out ahead of time if it's something you're going to do on a regular basis. Normally, I would leave this turned off unless you are specifically knowing that this is the right tool for the job. There are some limitations when you have this turned on, and so I would normally leave it off. But if you are going to use it, there is a view assistant where you can either see the mid-tone exposures or the highlights a little bit more easily when you are shooting through the viewfinder or on the back of the camera. And then kind of the same thing, but in the playback mode, where you see the midtones or the highlights a little bit more easily when playing back images in the camera or on an external device. All right, next up is the auto lightning optimizer. So we do have a lot of these features that we've been talking about in this camera where the camera is raising up the shadows, it's holding back the highlights, it's trying to give you as much dynamic range as possible. It's a little bit more important here in the movie section than in the stills because there's very few movie options where you get to shoot raw image file. In fact, there's only one that I can think of. And so if you are going to be shooting kind of standard video that you're not going to do any fancy color grading with afterwards, this is something that you might want to use a little bit more than you might have used it in the still mode. It's a little bit easier to have it done in camera and have a nice, easy to see film straight out of camera. And so leaving this in standard makes a little bit more sense here than in the stills mode. Next up is highlight tone priority. This is where it limits the low ISO that you can shoot at in order to kind of resurrect and keep those highlights from going too bright. Generally leaving it turned off. There's some special exceptions where you might want to leave it on in certain types of video. For gaining greater control over manual exposure, you can change from 3rd stops to 8 stops. And you probably already know whether you want this or not this. If you want to have very specific control when you're shooting in manual in the movie mode, yeah, 8 stops gives you just more control. There is more dial turning to get from one exposure to the next, but if you're in the same region most of the time, it's nice to have that control. The auto slow shutter. This is kind of a good and terrible thing to have on a camera. If you're going to hand the camera to somebody who has no idea what they're doing and they're going to shoot movies and they have no idea about shutter speeds and apertures, auto slow shutter is fantastic because if they go into a dark environment, the camera slows down the shutter speed so that you can see what's going on in that environment. And you get a nice even exposure going from one place to the other. For this person who knows what they're doing, changing shutter speeds while you're shooting is a horrible, terrible thing because the camera's not doing exactly what you want it to do. It doesn't have the right look. And they might want to change exposure using another system, ISO or aperture, for instance. And so this is really a very different setting depending on what level of movies you are shooting at. So be aware of that. Okay, moving on to page 3, moving through here quickly. White balance. Yep, I think we know about this now. Here so that you can have a separate setting from the stills mode again. We did our custom white balance in the photo shooting menu, and so this is great for when you don't know about the light that you're in. If you've got sunlight and you've got some artificial weird light that you don't know what it is and you're trying to get that area balanced right, shoot a photograph of a white or neutral colored object in here, come in here to custom white balance, set it as that, then go back up to white balance, set your white balance as custom white balance, and you'll be set for that environment. White balance correction, once again, hope you don't have to come here. Generally, most people will never need to come in here, but if you did need to tweak the colors just a little bit for some reason that's, out of the ordinary, you can come in here and do that, but normally leave that at 0. With the picture styles, this once again in the movies is a little bit more important than it is in stills because a lot of things are baked in the movie shooting mode. And so here is where you can create your own movie shooting grade, your color grade of how you want your image to look. You can pick one of the standards to start with, or you can go one of the custom settings where you set it yourself. Then you can go in and adjust the sharpness, the saturation, and the color tone exactly to your needs. So if the video you are shooting, as long as it's not raw, if that video is not coming out the way you want, this is one of the ways that you can deal with it. Now, this is the amateur way of dealing with it, and we're going to get into some more professional ways a little bit further into this menu. But this would be kind of the simplest, easiest way to do a tweak with your video settings so that it looks a little bit better in what you want to get straight out of the camera. Now, for those who are a little bit more serious about their color grading and the colors that they get from their movies, we have the Canon log settings. And so this is where the camera records the tonalities of the image in a very different way than it would normally. It's going to record an image that, frankly, looks terrible when it's ungraded. But once you get into the right files and you know what you're doing, you grade it, you color correct it, and it looks better than ever. So Canon log is one of those options. And so if you don't know what you're doing here, leave this turned off. For those of you that know, we have Canon log. There is a C log in here, which is what the camera came shipped with. There was a firmware upgrade to add C-Log3, which is something that most people are preferring at this point. It gives you a little bit wider latitude in dynamic range of what the camera can control. And so you have a view assist option in here. So when you are recording in log, like I said, it kind of looks like a terrible image, very flat, very little contrast, very little saturation, and you can turn the view assist on. That way, when you're looking through the camera, everything looks wonderful. But then when you get the footage back, it's this very muted, flat image that you do color grading to, and then it looks great again. And so this just makes shooting in the field a little bit easier and a little bit easier to see what the final look of the film is going to look like. The color matrix is kind of the color standard, and there is a neutral setting and then one that you can match up with other Canon cinema cameras. And so if you are trying to match this footage with other Canon products, you can get them kind of in the same color space and color look between the two of them. We also have some characteristics that we can change to the color, so lots of little color tweaking. So once again, if the colors are not perfect, this is one of those other areas that you can come in here and adjust. Normally though, you're going to leave this zeroed out. The color space, we talked about this in stills. We have different color spaces that we can choose from here in video. And depending on what the final result or purpose of your video is going to determine a little bit about what you choose here. Generally, the more serious you are, the larger the color gamut, but there's also a little bit more responsibility on your part in handling the files properly at that point, because they could shift out of control if you don't know what you're doing and choose the wrong one. Okay, the clarity option. Once again, this has been kind of set aside in its own area. This is going to add some contrast to the edges, can give a little bit sharper appearance to the image. Moving on to page 4, start with some lens aberration corrections, which is the same as the submenu that we saw in the still mode. First up is our peripheral illumination correction, which corrects for those dark corners. Generally kind of good to leave it on unless you are the type of person that specifically wants to get that natural look from the lens, which I know some of you will. Distortion correction fixes lenses that have barrel or pincushion distortion, quite frequent with some wide-angle lenses, often good to correct. The chromatic aberration is that little thing that nobody tends to like, this color ghosting that happens around solid objects with light in the background. So that's going to be a good thing to leave enabled as well. Diffraction correction corrects, or at least tries to correct a little bit for the loss of sharpness when shooting at very small apertures. Something else probably worth leaving on. All right, next up is our high ISO speed noise reduction. In this case, if you are just kind of an average shooter shooting basic simple video, yeah, you could leave it on standard and it is going to fix up a little bit of that high ISO when you are working in those higher speeds. For those of you who are a little bit more serious, you're going to probably leave this on disable, and you'll probably deal with that in post-production software. All right, moving quickly on to page 5, HDR movie recording. So several years ago, Canon introduced an HDR movie recording option, and we've actually seen probably 3 or 4 different versions of the ability of this camera to record a slightly different type of file to get you a greater dynamic range. And so this is one where it doesn't give you a lot of controls. It doesn't really give you any control except for on and off. And it's very limited in where it works. It works in FHD at 30 frames a second or 25, one standard compression, and there's a bunch of other restrictions on there. So my guess is that most people aren't going to use it. It's probably on there for mostly legacy reasons. And there might be a few people who want to give this a try. I have tested it. It does give you a little, it pulls the highlights back a little bit so you can see a little bit more detail. At the time it came out, it was the best option we had for getting greater dynamic range. But this camera has a lot of other tools at this point, so it's not nearly as relevant these days. All right, time-lapse movie. Now this is very similar to a previous interval timer mode that we talked about before. But in this case, we're going to shoot a whole bunch of pictures and it's compiled in the camera into a finished movie that is done. It's all baked in. You don't need any extra software on here. But the controls and the way it operates is very much the same way. Normally it's left off. Turn it on when you want to use it. Then you can dive in and set the interval. 10 seconds is nice interval, maybe a minute, maybe 3 seconds, depends on what you're shooting. And then the number of shots. I like to shoot around 300 shots because that gives me 10 seconds of 30 frames per second video. And that's a nice little clip of video to have. Shoot longer or necessary according to your needs. Then the recording size. Now, if you are shooting a time lapse, you are making a movie. What size of movie would you like to make? 8K, 4K, Full HD. Camera will not heat up shooting 4K here like it would under normal 4K times because it's shooting at such a slow interval, collecting those interval images. You can also have the camera put on auto exposure, and I've done a fair number of time lapses in my day, and most of the time I'm not using auto exposure. I want to set a specific shutter speed and aperture, and I want that to remain steady. There are some cases where the light's changing, and you can put the camera into an auto exposure mode. It really depends on the mode that you're in, whether that's going to work out for you or not. If you do put it into one of those auto exposure modes, do you want to fix it for the first frame? And if you do, why don't you just use manual exposure? I think that would probably be a better option, but if you did want to have it in automatic and lock it in the first frame, you could. I don't have a lot of good use cases that I can imagine for that, but it's there if you need it. And then the screen off. So this is something that you probably want to enable, which means that when it takes a photo, it doesn't expend battery power, which can become very valuable when you're shooting time lapse, showing you every image that it's taking. Because usually you set up a camera, you come back in 20 minutes or an hour and it's done, and you don't need to look at every photo as you're going along. So for battery savings, it's smart to turn this one off. Now, generally, most of you know what I feel about cameras that beep at you. Not a big fan. So I would definitely want to have this turned off. There are reasons where you might have the camera mounted in an unusual position and you can't tell if it's actually firing or not. And then, yeah, having a beep on it lets you confirm that it is actually taking a photo. So I hope you don't need this mode. Please use it sparingly around other people. All right, down at the bottom, you'll see the recording time and the playback time. So it's going to do the math in there for you about how many frames per second and how long your interval is and how long that shooting is going to be. And when you're all done, you're going to get a finished movie that you can play right in the camera or export for very, very easy use. All right, on to page 6, we have a self-timer in the movie mode. So if you don't have a remote, you want to get in the shot yourself. If you don't want to cause any vibrations with the camera moving when you touch the shutter release on it, a good option for getting things locked off solid straight from the beginning of the recording. If you do want to use a remote control, there are a few that you can choose from. We have a wireless one that uses Bluetooth technology. Gets you a little bit more distance than the infrared one, but it is more money and requires a little bit more in hooking it up with the camera. All right, page 7, image stabilizer mode. So the camera does have a physical sensor that moves to stabilize the shot, in-body stabilization, but this is a digital mode in here. And so what it does is it crops in a little bit, either a small crop, a 1.1 times crop, which is turning it on, or you can turn it on enhanced, and it crops in quite a bit. So you're going to lose a lot of your wide angle, but it's going to become more stable. So in an ideal world, you wouldn't need this because you would have a gimbal system for what you're doing. But if you don't have a gimbal system and you're just hand holding, see if you can get it to work with the 1.1 in most cases. I suppose the enhanced one might be of help if you are shooting with a telephoto lens. So give those a try if you're going to need them, but I would generally try to use the wider option of either turning it off, letting the camera and lens do its own system, because that way you're not cropping in on that sensor at all. All right, next up is a little bit of a submenu, shutter button for movies. When you press halfway down on the shutter release, when you're in the movie mode, what do you want to have happen? Generally, it's going to activate the meter system and it's going to focus. And you can have it either focus continuously or in a one-shot mode. And this completely depends on how you like to shoot your movies and so forth. Or you can have it just do metering only and not do any focusing. And you can be in charge of focusing either with back button focusing or manual focusing, turning the ring on the lens itself. Next up is what happens when you press down fully on the shutter release when you are in the movie mode. Generally, you can put no function. If you want to start recording movies because it's easier to hit that button than the actual movie record button, you can select that option if that works for you. The metering timer is how quickly the camera shuts down and kind of goes into its little sleep mode. Once you press the shutter release, 8 seconds, kind of a convenient time. Lengthen it or shorten it for convenience or battery power. We talked about the zebra settings back in the movies section, and you have 2 different zebras. The first zebra is a little bit different than on a lot of other cameras out there. Most cameras have zebras for just telling the top end. This is one that you can move up and down and show a region of the exposure that is in a particular place. And so you can choose 75% plus or minus 5%. And so it's going to show you everything in the 70 to 80% brightness range. You can actually invoke both Zebra 1 and Zebra 2 and have zebras in different areas of the exposure, warning you as far as where they are within that exposure. And it really depends on how you use the camera, how you're going to be able to make use of this. But the idea maybe for a simplistic setting is to set up Zebra 2 at 90 or 95% to show you when your exposure is getting to the very top end of what the camera can handle. Shooting info display. So this is a little submenu that controls all the different things that happen when we press the info button. So first up, you can go through all this little checklist. You can also edit these screens by pressing the info button while you're in this mode to choose what items you see on a particular screen. So another good area for you to customize the viewfinder and options to see exactly what you want to see in the monitors. You can do this for the back screen, which was the screen info settings, and this is for the viewfinder itself. Not as many options, but you still have a few to play with. If you like to have a grid display when you're shooting, you can turn it on here. A few different options available for you, depending on what you like. If you do like using a histogram for judging your exposure, you can jump in here and choose between a brightness histogram or an RGB. I prefer the RGB one. It's got a little bit more information to it. You can see if one of the channels is clipping out, and you can choose the size. Personal preference for me is small because it's taking less of the image area. So I'd probably choose that unless you specifically need a larger one because it's easier for you to see. The focusing distance will head us into another sub-menu, and this is where we get that focusing scale along the bottom of the screen, which can be very handy when focusing and trying to nail focus between a couple of different subjects. You can choose when this is turned on. When you're in the manual focus mode, it's kind of convenient, but if it kind of gets in your way within the frame, it'll only show up in when focusing when you are focusing. You can always have it in, or even when you're autofocusing to see where the camera is autofocusing. And some of you might like that just to kind of confirm where the camera is autofocusing. And then you can completely disable it if you don't ever want to see it. You can change your units from meters to feet. And that's our focusing distance information. All right, next up is our viewfinder display format. Once again, number 1 is the standard one. Number 2, if you can't get your eye close enough to the viewfinder to see the edges of the frame because you're wearing glasses or sunglasses or goggles or something else, then you can back it off to 2, and that makes the image a little bit smaller and a little bit easier to see with your eye a little bit further from the viewfinder. All right, last page in the movie shooting menu. Standby low resolution. When you set this on, it lowers the resolution during the standby to prevent overheating. Now this was formerly known as overheat control in previous firmware versions, and so they've kind of changed the name. And so what happens here is you can lower the viewfinder resolution, and that's going to prevent the camera from overheating in some cases. HDMI display is going to deal with working with HDMI cables plugged into the camera, either for large monitors like TVs or small monitors that you mount on the camera, which can also be recorders. And this first option is where do you want to see information on the back of the camera versus the HDMI device. Timecode will send us into a little bit of a sub-menu for you serious video shooters out there. First option is record run. This is going to be kind of a good basic one for most people. It just tells you how long you've been recording a particular clip. Another option is free run, which can be very helpful when you're shooting with a multicam setup and then you can have kind of a registration between different cameras as to where their clocks are in a free running situation. So when they start and stop recording, you can sync things up later. Start time recording, if you do want to reset things yourself, you can go in here and reset the clock that is going to be running during your videos. Reset it if you need to here. You can manually input time in the previous one, or you can set it to the camera's built-in clock and where it is set. The record count is going to show you in the playback, the record time, or the time code. And then the playback count, when you are playing back, it'll show you either the recording time or the time code as you prefer in here. All right, so the HDMI plug right there, the micro out type D. When you are sending things out through here, do you want the time code sent out through that? A lot of times it is good to have that sent out. We're having a lot of people hook up external monitors and recorders for it. Sometimes though you don't want that sent out, so you can turn it off, obviously. This one will allow you to start external recording devices by simply pressing the record button on the camera. That way you don't have to press two record buttons at the same time. So the drop frame will adjust the time code labeling of the frame to match other devices if you need to. So this is something that has a discrepancy when you're shooting at the 29.97 frames per second. Usually that's going to be left on enable. And I think that's it, folks. We have made it through the movie shooting menu, so hopefully you've got your camera adjusted for shooting top quality movies.